So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Tate. I was a graduate of the Firehose project back in May. Ken was my mentor. And I spent some time at block.io. There's not going to really be any discussion of that, but just to give you guys an understanding, I I had I had a little bit of technical experience before starting an online apprenticeship, but I just wanted to share some of my various experiences when it came to how do I get rid of this menu for this thing? Anybody know how you get rid of the menu for Zoom?
I don't think you can.
Well, that's a really cool feature. All right, screw it. It's not that distracting. So anyway, my presentation's called.
Hey, if you hover over it, there's like 4 boxes.
Yeah.
You can minimize it.
You can?
We can't see any of the menu. Only you can see
can't?
that.
You can just see the presentation?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. This is going very well. Anyway, so, really what I came to understand through both the academic process and the interviewing process was how much it actually benefits you to be somewhat ignorant in an area, and how you should, temper your own expectations in terms of what you're capable of, and how questions can really be your best friend when it comes to any part of any job process. So just to give you a little background on myself, I was a former professional lacrosse player, head of sales, and a varsity coach. I'm not telling you this because I'm bragging. What I'm telling you is that my background lent itself towards positions in which immediate contribution was really my biggest attribute. So I'm used to those sort of environments where you step in and you do something right away. So reorienting myself and changing my perspective was a huge part about being successful. And not that I'm successful as a developer, but I just had to reset my own expectations in terms of what I was capable of within this variant. So on my very first interview, should have been very simple. I was just asked to build a basic Rails application. I did it remotely, so I had a guy doing a screen share, much like we're doing now. It sounds simple enough, so he just said, build me a controller, throw in some methods, and we can sort of discuss the idiosyncrasies afterwards. But I never asked any questions. I just started coding. I just started whipping out lines of code, trying to remember what I had done at the Firehose project. And I was nervous, and I was committing spelling errors, and it was a pretty terrible process because I simply tried to build what I thought they wanted to see and missed several key features and components in terms of what they were trying to distinguish from the interview itself. I mean, anybody can create a controller by going online and Googling, how do I create a Rails controller? But it takes a different mind to really understand why you're creating it and a more efficient way of doing it. So needless to say, I didn't get the job. So my second interview experience was a little different. It was an in-person interview in which whiteboarding was the thing. And I'd never actually been on a whiteboarding interview. I'd only heard the horrors of whiteboarding. So I went up there and I was given this problem. And it's, given 2 variables, which both contain integer values, swap the 2 values without introducing a third variable. And spoiler alert, this is now lesson number 11 in the advanced job prep section on the Firehose project. I'm not saying I gave it to Ken as content, but it would be nice to be mentioned in a footnote. Just, plagiarism is a problem. So how did I proceed this time? I actually, before I even wrote anything or even picked up a marker, I asked the interviewer to write the problem on a whiteboard. I said, will you spell out the instructions? So he obliged, which was nice. He didn't have to do that. And then I asked every conceivable question I could think of. I mean, what did I have to lose? So I fired question after question at him, and I recorded the answers that I had, what I thought was pertinent, on the whiteboard itself. So then I had a general framework in which to operate. Now, I then mistakenly, albeit effectively, admitted that I didn't have a technical background. And so my reasoning behind asking all the questions is I was trying to understand every possible piece and scenario before beginning, because I didn't want to screw up again. And when somebody's watching you whiteboard, it's even more intense than when you're sharing your screen. When you're sharing your screen, and I'll admit I did this, you can fake like the connection went down and actually sever the screen share. I'm not advising that you do that during an interview, but it's possible to do so that people don't know you're not doing it correctly. Whereas if you're doing it on a whiteboard, you could just run out of the room, but that would reflect far more negatively on you as a potential applicant. So as soon as I said that, I actually saw his eyes light up, and I didn't realize at the time, but after I completed the problem, I had spent a fair amount of time doing it. He looked at me and said, it's not what you know, but how you learn that appeals to employers. Things can be taught, but they can only be taught to those that are receptive to understanding. So that was a really big takeaway from this interview. And just to give you guys the spoiler in terms of how it's done, it's just a simple substitution problem. It's a temporary substitution in which you change a variable's value and then do some very basic addition or subtraction, or you can do multiplication and division if you want to. And it's simple enough. I mean, really, it's a 3-step problem. But if you don't ask questions, even the most simplistic subject matter can become infinitely more complex. So that really stuck with me. And so I eventually got an offer from this place, but I'm currently a Java developer for a firm in Minneapolis. My background is with a brief foray in Python, and then obviously the Ruby on Rails immersive apprenticeship with some JavaScript and HTML with the Firehose project. But even before I was hired at this juncture, I was very transparent with the person who was offering me the position. And several times I tried to rebuff the offer saying, I don't know if I'm qualified for this. But he kept telling me, it's not my prior knowledge as the metric that they use to measure my ability, but my enthusiasm, my understanding of complex subject matter, and my desire to learn. So, I'll continue on, but really, when it comes to an interview process, you can be wrong in several different aspects. But if you hit on key components that they're looking for, if you're teachable, if you're friendly, and if you show an enthusiasm to learn, that resonates far more than having the ability to actually create a complex algorithm on a whiteboard. Anecdotally, if you haven't asked Ken about his experience in his whiteboarding problem, I highly suggest you have him give you that little tale because it was inspiring to me. You may not get the answer, but what they want to see is, are you going to apply the necessary effort, or do you get discouraged easily? Because quite frankly, most of my job is chasing down bugs and trying to find what broke. If I were to give up and get discouraged, then I wouldn't be much of an asset to the firm. But it's not that I understand, our framework. It's not that I understand our IDE. It's not that I understand our complex database schema. It's that I'm willing to chase things down. And before you guys jumped on the call, Colin and Ken and I were saying that the modern developer is mostly a graduated Googler. But you have to know what to Google, and you have to be persistent enough to continue to Google. So anyway, on my first day, I stepped in there, and not having any background in Java, except for a little bit of stuff I'd done on my own, I was asked to quote-unquote step through the code and pose some questions. So this is one of our simpler sides of our code. It's our queue messaging, which is how do we handle messages that come from the queue. What my firm does, just contextually, is we do analytics for suppliers and retailers. So think of Dick's Sporting Goods and Nike. They communicate with each other via documentation. We're the third-party middleman that handles all their documents. So if this looks overwhelming to you, imagine being on your first day and imagine somebody paying you to take a look at this. It's nice to be paid, but when you don't understand, your natural response is, well, it's my first day, or quack, quack, quack. So, it's very imperative that you make them understand, training wheels, right? You got to walk before you can run. So my response was, keep asking questions, anything I could think of. I have a notebook just full of inane questions and responses. And I ask for any resource that they might have as part of their library. Every company that you're going to work for is going to have a litany of resources at their disposal. Whether or not their developers choose to leverage those is another story. But I was sitting next to a guy who'd been there for 5 years, and I asked him about good books that the firm had on the basics of Java. He said he hadn't seen any. Well, I looked over 5 minutes after he had said that, and he was using this $150 Java textbook as a monitor stand. So I really think, kind of missing the forest for the trees there, but you have to be persistent, So what I would do is speak with anybody who had a hand in the code. Any person who'd ever touched the code base, I would ask them, because you can kind of see signatures, and then, a lot of different people are going to touch a code base. But if you understand what they were trying to accomplish, it makes it a lot easier, because every specific developer has a different methodology for basically peeling the same apple. It's difficult because sometimes it's esoteric, sometimes it's, an outdated method. But in order to understand why they're doing it, you need to talk to them. So, I leveraged any online tutorial I could find. And to be honest, the firm was more than happy to pay for them. And then I spoke with Ken. The great part about the Firehose project is that you have these mentors, and they're not just your mentors during the program, they're your mentors after the program. I mean, I probably email Ken. We correspond once a week, once every 2 weeks, just things of that nature. And he's always willing to help out. I don't know. I can't speak the same for Marco. I don't know if I ever see Marco, but nah, just kidding. But, and after talking to Ken, it was like, well, now I can understand, 9 words in that book. So, you're progressing, right? Like you start to get context and a framework, you start to understand what's happening. I'm not saying that you're actually, proficient, but you're not completely retarded. You're just retarded enough to not be dangerous, And so the nice part was, so just to toot my own horn a little, this was my first addition to the code base. This was a branch I pushed up last week. This was a calculation for determining timeliness in terms of when retailers actually send their goods out. So obviously I had some assistance with this, but this was my first contribution to the code base. It felt pretty good. My natural reaction was, I am the smartest man alive, only to find out that we're in the midst of a code freeze, so none of this will actually go into production until February. That doesn't, detract from how great I feel about myself. But, it's always nice to be wanted, and nice to be a contributing member of the team. So, persistence is key. Asking tons of questions and just understanding that you don't know and that people understand that you don't know. And the one thing that employers really dislike is somebody who A, is unwilling to admit they don't know something, or B, unwilling to cooperate within a team to actually accomplish that goal. So, there's a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation. I mean, my first day on the job, I actually wore a suit, which apparently is like super big faux pas when it comes to being a developer. If you guys ever get a job, don't wear a suit your first day because you look like an asshole. Excuse my language, but don't be that guy. Okay, it's like wearing the shirt of the band you're going to see. Don't be that guy. But ask as many questions as you can and be willing to admit your own ignorance, because people are far more willing to cooperate with you when you are willing to listen. So that's about all I have. I know I ran a little over, so any questions you guys have, I'm willing to answer. And before I do, these are some of the resources that I use, and they're fantastic. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Pluralsight, but it's an incredibly good, it's got sections and then subsections and then subsections within the subsections. So, it's video-based, but it's got a lot of good granular information for really complex subject matter. Obviously, Code Academy and Code School, it's nice because Code Academy, you get your hands inside the code, so you do some real-time development. Code School is nice because it gives you the videos and asks you follow-up questions. Udemy is a great site. I just kind of find through a friend of mine. They usually can be expensive, but for some reason, they keep sending me emails about $15 programs, which makes me think I overpaid, which is awesome. But any language, any framework you want, they have a ton of information, and they're always adding new content. And then one of the things I did before I started was get involved in open source projects like GitHub, because you can bring down an actual code base, you can break it, you can re-break it, you can keep breaking it, and it doesn't really matter because even if you try to put it back up, most times it won't be accepted. So any questions, comments, feedback, anything you guys want to know, I'm more than happy to answer.
What are your thoughts on Java, Tate?
I don't know if I have enough time to cover all my thoughts on Java. But, it's not a bad language. It's actually, the more I learn about it, the more I like it. It's very declarative. You have to say everything. You have to state if something is going to throw an exception, because Java compilers won't actually handle your code. So for those who don't know about Java, it's a compiling language, meaning everything has to be done in linear fashion. It has to be done correctly for any part of the code to run. So that means, unlike Ruby, where you can run a certain section of code and then an error will populate, this all has to be done correctly. So you have to hard code exception handling into your code and then state specifically what type of value is going to be returned from a method. If it's a public or a private, if something doesn't get returned, you can't leave it blank. You have to put void. It's the idiosyncrasies can get frustrating at times, but Java is the most prevalent coding language. So it's not bad, and it's very flexible. and there's a ton of resources, which is nice. So if you encounter a problem, odds are several thousand people have encountered it before. So if you guys ever do start coding in Java, don't post on Stack Overflow until you do your homework, because I got yelled at twice for that by moderators on Stack Overflow, and they don't like redundancy. So yeah, it's a pretty good language.
Cool, good stuff. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I have another question. How easy was the transition coming from Ruby into Java?
I'm still in the midst of it. So I understood the framework, right? It was a lot like learning Latin and trying to study a different Romance language. So it's like understanding the root of a word, but not understanding the nuances. So it wasn't that hard, because sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, this, and this. I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember what that's supposed to do. So as long as you sort of remember the fundamentals, it's not too bad. The biggest issue really is just changing the way you think about programming. Because if you try and think of it as like, I'm going to force my way through it, that's a bad perspective to take. So once I learned that while in school with you guys, really anything is accomplishable. It's just kind of, if one route doesn't work, back up, try a different way. So not that difficult. And really, I think once you learn something like Ruby, there's a lot of other languages that are at least somewhat similar that can be explored.
I have a question. Tate, how do you like your current job, and how would you compare it to what you were doing previously?
Okay, well, certain aspects I love. I love development. It's the most powerful thing I've ever done. I love it because I feel like coding is now the modern industrial revolution, right? So every time, like, creating that branch was honestly the best feeling I've had in a long time. So I love that aspect of it. I don't necessarily love being in a big dev shop. There's about 1,200 people, not all developers, but 1,200 people at SBS Commerce. So it's very bureaucratic and things move really slowly. We had a meeting today to discuss things we'd like to do to make our implementation more efficient. And a lot of things could be handled pretty quickly. But again, we're in the middle of a code freeze, and we have to get the go-ahead from 3 different department heads before we can put anything into practice. So the inefficiencies of a larger company start to wear on me at times, because I feel like that undermines my ability to do my job. But I wouldn't trade being a software developer for anything in the world. It is so much fun to create something and watch it come to life, and to contribute to a code base, and to figure out complex problems. I mean, it's like solving a Rubik's Cube every day, right? Like, you start from scratch and you build it up, you test it, it fails, you're frustrated, start over again, test it, it fails, you curse, yell at your dog. There's a lot of things that go into it, but then that sense of accomplishment once you get to the end, the finish line, it's pretty awesome. So I like it. I also get to work remotely 3 days a week. So wearing sweatpants every day is pretty darn sweet. Like, that was the reason I wanted to be in medicine, is so I could wear scrubs, but I can't stand the sight of other people's blood. So, but yeah, I really like software development, and I also like the resources of a larger corporation. Like I said, if I want to do an online tutorial, if I want to sign up for a new software, like I just started working with Sumo Logic. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but $1,000 for an annual subscription is nothing to a company this large. So we just submit it, they pay for it. It's awesome. So it has its pros and its cons, but it's a great place to learn. I have a ton of great developers that I work with. So my goal was just to get better as a software developer, and I feel like I am doing so. Sorry if that was long-winded.
How's Minnesota as far as jobs go? I know the economy is similar to Wisconsin, especially in my area. Did you have troubles running into finding like Ruby and Rails jobs? Versus Minneapolis a little bit better, but
yeah, yes and no. I was offered 2 positions. One was a Rails development position here in Rochester, and then this other one was the Java position. So Twin Cities is fantastic. I wanted to stay in Rochester and work remotely most of the time, so that really narrowed my search. So it made it a little more difficult to find work. I was probably looking for start with the position in August, so probably about 3 months. Going full tilt. But Minneapolis, St. Paul actually has a very large tech community. They host an annual TechStars event up there. They have
There's a lot of tech companies based in
yeah, there's a ton.
Minneapolis.
And actually, so last year, being 2014, 6 different tech firms had IPOs coming out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So there's a pretty big community out here, and there's meetups, there's cooperative working spaces. So it's actually a pretty good environment for tech. Now, obviously, once you get to the sort of surrounding rural areas, I'm down in Rochester, so it's mostly medical, and the primary software is C++.
Yeah.
So
That's how my entire area is too.
yeah, so but there's always that one-off. So the Ruby firm that I was offered a position from is down here in Rochester. So, I mean, randomly, I found them through, some circuitous route, and we started talking. So, but I wouldn't, pin my hopes on something like that. So Minneapolis is great. Everything else, which is, comprises like the 95% of the geography out here, not so great.
Right. Cool.
Good stuff. Anybody else have anything for Tate?